Things are looking good for Tiny Tina's Wonderlands. We just had a new hotfix with some great changes, plus the first piece of Season Pass content is pretty close to releasing. And thanks to some interesting finds from the community, we already have a look at what true endgame gear is going to look like. So let's go over all of that in this video, a like would be super appreciated, and let's go. And I want to start by giving a shout out to Noted Sinner in our comments, who posted that they found multiple ascended weapons. In case you didn't know, when you're playing at higher chaos levels, gear can drop in chaotic variants, which means they have higher stats than a regular version of the same level. So far, we're only supposed to get chaotic and volatile versions of weapons, but Sinner and others have already found weapons from an even higher tier. Which is also something Matt Cox, who is the creative director on Wonderlands, posted on Twitter before the launch of the game. Next to chaotic and volatile, he also lists to higher tiers, Primordial and Ascended, noting that these will be made available by a yet to be determined DLC. But yeah, here we already have images from Redditors Zimbox and Neon Bananas showing Ascended gear in their game. When comparing the stats on the Ascended Fatebreaker to my level 40 Fatebreaker, we can see that the damage on the regular version is 674, whereas the Ascended version has 1342, so almost double the damage. The damage difference between the two auto magic pistols is even crazier, although I have a feeling that this one might be bugged since it jumps from 167 to 2986 times 3 damage. Either way, these weapons showing up is likely a bug, but we will be able to loot them in-game after they increase the cap on chaos levels with the release of a certain piece of DLC. And the first piece of DLC is already coming out very soon, the 21st of April, and thanks to the post-launch trailer and the official website, we already know a lot of what we can expect. We'll be meeting a new character called Vesper and visiting a new area called the Dreamville Overlook. From there, we can enter the Mirror of Mystery, which will send us to a new dungeon and fight a new boss at the end of it. Interestingly enough, we'll have a reason to revisit this boss each week, as the website notes that after launch, a powered up version of the final boss becomes available each week. Defeat it and you'll unlock the next hardest level until you finally reach its final form. And of course, we will get better loot as well, so I assume that final form is going to drop some amazing stuff. So that already sounds really interesting, but we also have another new source of loot in the form of Vesper's Wheel of Fate. We can spin this wheel by using Lost Souls, which are a currency earned from defeating bosses in the Mirror of Mystery. We already see it in action in the trailer as well as on the screenshot here, where we can see icons for different types of loot on the wheel. Finally, completing a Mirror of Mystery dungeon will also add those levels and bosses to the Chaos Chamber rotation, so every DLC expands the core endgame activity as well. On top of the Season Pass DLC, we also learned that we will see free live events in the post-launch content for Wonderlands, as the most recent hotfix introduced the first of these events, which gives us a higher chance of finding the very rare loot enemies. We'll cover that and the new featured run in the Chaos Chamber, which is of course also content on a weekly rotation, in a bit, but first I want to cover the most interesting part of the recent hotfix. So let's talk about the weapon changes. There are a lot of exciting buffs here, most of them are for shotguns, but there are some changes to assault rifles too. First on the list are black powder shotguns, who've seen their damage increased. This means that the already insane Rain of Arrows shotgun, which is a black powder shotgun, is now even more powerful. As you can see, the damage on mine went from 500 times 5 to 737 times 5, which is an increase of almost 50%. We already covered this amazing shotgun that lets you shoot a barrage of arrows in a previous video, and back then it was already amazing, but obviously now it's even better thanks to this buff. And we can see the same thing on the crossblade, another black powder shotgun we mentioned in that video, which has seen its damage increased from 568 to 837, so again a huge jump up in damage on a weapon that was already great before the hotfix. Of course, keep in mind that we're just highlighting some of the best weapons of this hotfix here, but any weapon that falls under the same category, no matter its rarity or level, will have received a similar buff in damage. Now the biggest winner of this hotfix, at least in my opinion, is the Rogue Imp. This Skulldugger assault rifle was already one of my favorites, but with the new hotfix active, it absolutely shreds. The damage on mine went from 330 times 2 to 474 times 2, so not as big of an increase as the black powder shotguns, but the increase is still very noticeable. This assault rifle has a unique effect as well, as when it breaks you shoot out 3 homing projectiles that deal fire damage to an enemy. I think the damage on these has been buffed as well, but your main source of damage will be the actual shots from this weapon though, which are very powerful, decently accurate and pretty fast too. We also have an increase to the damage of Hyperius shotguns, which means that the amazing Red Hellion was also buffed. As you can see here, it went from 97 to 141 times 4 damage. This is another pretty powerful weapon, weapon that is now even stronger, although this one requires some work from you in order to make it shine. It will increase its pellet count, so the amount of projectiles fired based on your current movement speed buffs. So if you can stack a lot of these with equipment or class skills, you can make this weapon even stronger. And finally, Farrier shotguns also had their damage increased, but the change to these was a lot less impactful, as my bloodshot went from 89 to 102 times 7 damage. We of course also saw a nerf to Dahlia assault rifles, and yeah, I'm afraid to say this one is pretty significant too. The damage from my mistrial of the Gull went from 300 to 235 per shot, which means it lost close to a third of its damage. I picked up a different Dahlia rifle as the mistrial was at a lower level to test out if these were still viable, and while you can definitely still do damage at mid-tier chaos levels, I'd be lying if I didn't tell you I'd rather use the Rogue Imp over it. So, like I mentioned earlier, next to these changes, the hotfix also added the first weekly event to Wonderlands. During this event, optional opportunities, loot type enemies will appear more frequently in the Tangled Drift and Mount Crawl regions of the map. So that's the first two side areas you are able to unlock. In case you don't know, some enemy factions have a loot type enemy that spawns very rarely. Most of these are immune to any damage type except melee attacks and will drop a lot of gold and or gear when hit and when they die. They also seem to teleport out if left alone for too long, so you'll want to make them your priority when you spot one of them. With the event active, you'll be seeing them a lot more, and while they're not exactly a common sight, I did see more of them exploring these areas with the event active than I have in my entire time playing the game up until now. And I think it's safe to say that we will see more events like this in the future, with different regions of the map being the highlight each week. Even though the current one will end at 9 AM PT on April 14th, we already discovered some things that will be useful to know for future events too. The most interesting find is that it looks like Chaos Chamber rooms inspired by the areas mentioned in the event are also affected by the increased spawn chance for loot enemies. This week's featured run has multiple rooms inspired by both the Mount Crawl and Tangled Drift region, and I found loot enemies in each of them during my runs, which I don't think is a coincidence. There's another cool thing going on with the current featured run, by the way, but we will touch on that in a little bit. Another thing I noticed is that playing on higher chaos levels seems to spawn these loot enemies in more frequently. It might just be down to luck, but when playing on lower chaos levels I barely saw any loot enemies still, while at chaos 10 I was able to find one at least pretty much every run. And finally, you want to look for a place where you can spawn in a lot of enemies, as the more enemies spawn, the higher the chance that one of them will turn up a loot enemy. For the current event, I like to head to the Murder Church in the Tangled Drift, where you can jump down from the balcony to already spawn a big wave of enemies. After defeating them, travel back to the Murder Church fast travel point, then head out and take the slide. Following this route will take you past a lot of enemies, and I've had a lot of luck spawning loot enemies using this tactic. Of course, when you are done, you can reset all enemies by either traveling back to Brighthoof or by changing your Chaos modifier. Now, something we'll definitely be seeing more of in the future are the featured runs. You can select it at the Dragon Lord when selecting your Chaos run type, and you will also see for how long the current featured run will remain active. After running it a couple of times, I can confirm it is the same every time you run through it. So each encounter, location, boss and buff will be the same for all players. Which means that with the run at the time of the recording, every player will find that the final encounter before the boss fight will be a mimic only encounter. Which also means that if a good room for farming legendary weapons shows up in a future featured run, everyone can benefit from it. When that happens, we will of course let you know. Remember to leave a like if you liked the video and subscribe as well if you don't want to miss the next one. If you want, you can watch our previous video on some great tips for farming legendary weapons. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.